Good. That's true. We are here. Let me get my notes. Folks got real quiet. That's okay.
You put on your teacher voice, that's why.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, you've been trained.
I'm not sure if I need a mic. The SOE just recently, kind of after being here for 5 years, they produced like my faculty profile video. And so I saw a picture of me teaching, and I was like, oh my goodness, So I'm gonna do more reading than I normally would in my classes, just because I saw myself and I had all of the hand gesticulations and the pacing, and I was like, this is so distracting. So I'm gonna be up here on this wooden podium, so just kind of bear with me. And I think I got my card. Come on in, folks. So I think I want to just first welcome everyone for being here. I think we have a lot of current students, yes? Yeah, okay. IME. Ted. That's my department. DLS. Am I missing some other folks? Oh yeah. All right, come on in. We got more room over here. That's right. Whoa. We got you.
I was that excited about O&M.
Yeah. We see. Come on in. And so maybe presenters can be over here. Yeah, maybe presenters can be over here. We didn't actually think this many people cared about the book, so we apologize for the space of the room. We also understand that some of you were kind of like, you were forced to come here today, so we also want to recognize that. But I want to thank everyone for being here. I am David Phillipson. I am an assistant professor in teacher education. I am affiliated in IME as well, and I am one of the many contributors and editors of this particular piece that we're going to talk about today, Crafting Homeplace in the Academic Borderlands. So really excited for us to be here to do so. All right, so, and I'm working off two different laptops. So I wanted to start here, okay? And so just by maybe hand, okay, do we know who this is? Okay. No, please, Monisha, yeah. So a couple folks? Okay. All right, so we should all know Septima Clark. Okay. And I wanted to start with these images, right? As a way of getting us started and kind of settling in. And she was master teacher of what some people may call critical pedagogy, without that name, right? So for many of us kind of in the genealogy and in the values of USF School of Education of the book, wanted to kind of pay homage, right, to the folks that have come before us and the lessons and the jewels that they provided for us, okay? And so when we think about someone like Septima Clark, who really showed us what it means to learn alongside one another, to organize and educate with and for community, literacy not just as a skill but as a tool for liberation, right? And so she worked with various community-based organizations from Highlander Folk Institute to SNCC, and always reminds us, right, that knowledge is most powerful when it's collective and when it's in service of justice, okay? So I thought this quote from her was a fitting way to call us into this space today, okay? And so Septima Clark says that I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. And we need to be taught to study rather than believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. And so I love this quote because it's not just about learning, it's about how we learn, okay? And it's a reminder that our people have always been in study, have always been in deep inquiry with each other. And so that's the ability to ask, to challenge, to wrestle with ideas has always been a fundamental part of our tradition of learning and schooling, okay? In education broadly. And so this is why we're here today. And so while this is a book launch for this really dope book, it's also an invitation for us to continue thinking together, to question together, to reflect on what it means to build a home place, both as a practice, but also as a political project. And we're going to talk more about that today. Okay? And so while we want to celebrate the launch of the book, right, we also want to signal that the book was both a tangible artifact that we're really proud of, but it was also a really important process. And so we want to lift up all of those kind of varying lessons. And so as an artifact, it holds some insights, commitments, and struggles of all those folks who contributed to it. A body of knowledge that perhaps begins to document this idea of crafting a home place. But I think just as importantly, the process of creating the book through study, through dialogue, collective meaning making that really helped to shape its pages, that in and of itself is a lesson in home place and humanization. And so the book and the process embodies what it argues. Okay? That knowledge is not just produced, but cultivated through relationship study and a fundamentally deeply relational work. Okay? So the book didn't emerge in isolation. And before we I continue with my comments, I want to just take a moment just to kind of recognize and lift up the many, many hands that were part of the project. So I want to invite all co-authors of the book. Please stand, be recognized, give them some love. Please, who else doesn't want to stand? There we go. Yeah. Great job. So your words, your commitments, your experiences give the book life, and we want to honor the work that you've contributed to this collective effort. I also want to deeply, deeply, deeply acknowledge the co-editors of this volume, so Professors Jean-Paul Kuhn and Emma Fuentes. Professor Fuentes is not feeling well. We want to send her some love, so please reach out for those of you that are in community with her as well. They didn't tell me, right? So oftentimes, right, academia is super hierarchical. There's all types of, publishing formalities, and so we try to be very intentional with not having, we all get credit as co-editors, but they didn't. Typically you do it in alphabetical order, and but we did the inverse of that. So we start with P. Go to K, then we go to M, right? And they didn't tell me that I was going to have to be the one to talk about the book. So it's no surprise that I learned so much in this process, right, with two very critical mothers, okay? For those of you that study kind of, critical feminist epistemologies, we would call that mother wit. Okay? So I'm up here today, okay? So I want to acknowledge, right, these editors, all right? I also want to just kind of signal the book and both the content and the process of it emerges from a much larger commitment to reimagining education. And so not just as an isolated pursuit, but as a deeply relational collective piece. And this is part of ongoing work really challenging us to think about how knowledge is produced and shared within institutions like USF. And so this work has been deeply, incredibly supported and cultivated through and alongside the Center for Humanizing Education and Research, or CHER, okay, which has created a space for these types of critical educational questions at USF, but beyond, that really is thinking about how to engage in the type of study that we need. And so none of this, the book or CHER, would be possible without the leadership and ongoing support of our dean, Professor Shabnam. Thank you, Shabnam, who has continued to really prioritize a vision of humanizing relationality in our school that I think is really, really important, right? And one that I think we don't always recognize when we're in a space like this. For those of us that have been in other institutions, like, it's very, very clear, right, how we have tried to at least center care, collectivity, and this idea of what transformative scholarship can even be. So thank you, Dean, again, for your commitment to this work. And I'm sure I'm missing other folks. So various staff at USF to Teachers College, just want to thank you to all the different hands that touched the project. So give them some love real quick. And this is what happens when you have the person who was asked to kind of talk about the book also do the intro, right? I'm going to talk for about a little bit longer than I want to, okay? So please bear with me for probably about maybe another 10 minutes, okay? But before we get into the heart of the discussion of the book, I wanted to just take a step back, okay? And I want to share a brief story. So some of you may be familiar with the parable of the 3 stonecutters. Are you familiar? Yes? Real quick? Okay, good. So this is a lot of unfamiliar. It was unfamiliar for me as well, okay? But I think it's particularly instructive in this social political moment, and it's particularly instructive as a way for us to think about the many different tensions that we're navigating in the academy, but of course our broader struggles in questions around justice, around belonging, around transformation. So I was thinking of some of the key ideas of the book that I wanted to share with us today, and I came across this and I thought it was germane, okay? So I want to just take a little bit of time to talk about the story of the stonecutters. And I'm going to provide a very kind of brief version of it. And so it goes something like this. So you have a traveler that comes across 3 stonecutters. And it's clearly not Bay Area weather because they're laboring, they're toiling under the hot sun, and they're all perspiring and they're sweating. And so the traveler asks the first worker, what exactly are you doing? And so without looking up, right, the worker mutters, she says, I'm cutting stone. So the traveler moves on and asks the second worker, what are you doing? And that worker wipes their brow, right, and says, I'm shaping a block to fit a wall. Okay, and so finally, the traveler, approaches the third worker, okay, who was working just as hard as everyone else, okay, but perhaps maybe had a different kind of air that was a little bit different about them. Okay? And maybe we'd say it's a different sense of purpose. And so the traveler repeats the same question. Okay? And so the worker smiles and looks up and says, I'm building a great cathedral. Okay? Now, of course, my mind, I immediately say, well, what's a cathedral? I'm not religious, right? But let's kind of pause, for those of you that go there, pause that, right? Maybe you can think of a different structure that comes to mind, right? But I want to use this as kind of a metaphor. And so the story reminds us that how we name our work profoundly shapes the nature of that work. From how we work to what exactly we build. So collectively, how do we understand the nature of our work? How do we name and clarify our political project? Its purpose, its goals. For some of us that work within maybe institutional context, i.e. schooling, okay, are our goals on behalf of our community and people, or are they merely institutional benchmarks? Are we just preparing folks to navigate systems that are built without them in mind, or are we building something greater? Okay, so what is our vision of education or maybe scholarship in pursuit of something that is more transformative, liberatory, okay, restorative? Okay, and so that's why we're here today, to think about and hopefully clarify this idea of what is our cathedral. Okay, to ensure that hopefully we're not just cutting stone, we're not just shaping blocks, but we're building towards a project that has a level of clear, moral, ethical, political purpose. Okay, so in lieu of that, right, we know what happens when we don't name what we're building. Okay, someone else will do that for us. And so this book, right, is about trying to get at the heart of some of those purposes. All right? So, we know who this is? Yeah. Okay. It's okay if we don't. That's why we're here, right? So, in returning to Bell Hooks's conception of a home place, right, we hear an articulation of not just home as a shelter or a retreat, but a site for active resistance. And so a space where even in the face of domination, we can restore dignity. We can center our knowledge. We can refuse to be erased. But home place, right, as we think about this idea of home place, when it's crafted within institutions that were not necessarily designed for us, requires a particular kind of codification of values. Okay? And what we understand and have tried to speak to as humanization. So I want to lift up some of this engagement of a humanizing practice in the book, right? In particular, kind of thinking about how the book talks about the what, the who, and the how of that work. Okay, so what exactly are we building? So what are we building? So first we recognize that our work in the academy, right, is an experimentation of sorts. It's an attempt to carve out Homeplace in an institution that's not designed for us. So in Crafting Homeplace, we speak to the tensions of shifting institutions to try to create free spaces of perhaps more engagement, more study, a different kind of care, all the while being really attuned to the contradictions. Okay, so how the very logics of what we resist still show up in us and in the work. Okay, so we're clear that the liberation we seek is not in the institution itself, but in the people, in the relationships, in the collective structures that we build within it. So who? So who are we building with and who are we building for? Those of us in this work, right, of the book, shared something fundamental, a way of seeing the world, perhaps deeply shaped by histories of colonialism, imperialism, and various forms of othering. And so many of us exist in the academic borderlands, where we're neither fully inside or outside, okay? But what connected us was a refusal, right, to be merely symbols of perhaps diversity, of passive participants in the academy's kind of self-congratulatory narratives that oftentimes we hear. And so instead, we're building for those who understand that academia is not neutral, right? That knowledge must be disarticulated from the kind of decorative imitation and instead re-articulated or reformed towards political praxis. And as Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, right, we do not seek to decorate the halls of the university. We seek to transform the very conditions under which knowledge is produced, shared, and held. So how are we building? In Crafting Homeplace, we name key features of this humanizing work. Right? Principles that have emerged from lived struggle, from daily labor of making home, perhaps within a hostile terrain. So we talk about situatedness, okay, naming where we stand, understanding our histories, rooting our work in material realities, consciousness raising, right, cultivating consciousness, critical consciousness as a central piece, okay, praxis, collaboration, right, that's non-hierarchical, this idea of becoming, relationality, and lastly, this idea of place-based solidarities. Okay, so one important offering of the book is that it doesn't just theorize this. It documents some lessons about struggling to build it. And so while we don't claim to have all the answers or have it all figured out, it signals what humanization and Homeplace means in practice and community, even when we sometimes fumble through that clarity. Okay, and I think this is one of the most important contributions of the book. Okay, so in the book, you'll see examples of home placing and the fight for humanization across curriculum, right? The fight for ethnic studies, for anti-racist, decolonial pedagogies that do more than diversify the syllabus, but actively disrupt logics of white supremacy, of racial capitalism, of coloniality. We see it in youth organizing programs like DALE, where students do not just reflect on injustice, but engage in the political work of community transformation. You see it in community-based educational movements, such as the work in Half Moon Bay with Alas, where education is reclaimed as an act of healing, storytelling, and cultural reclamation. And we see it in the radical mentorship and collective faculty organizing, where knowledge is not just hoarded, but shared, right? And so where this kind of neoliberal cult of individualism is replaced by an ethic of collective care and interdependence. And so as I kind of close in thinking about the struggle and the promises of Homeplace, I want to return back to Hooks's reminder that Homeplace has always been a site of resistance. Okay? A space where in the face of dehumanization, women, and black and brown women in particular, have carved out places to restore our collective dignity, to love and to nurture freedom dreams. And so as we extend this idea into institutions that were never designed for this, okay, spaces like higher education, I want to just read a passage from the text reflecting on Hooks's notion of Homeplace and then leave you with some questions to sit with. Okay? So in Homeplace, Bell Hooks opens with a very brief Homeplace, A Site of Resistance, her 1997 book. Bell Hooks opens with a brief and powerful description of her sense of childhood dread in leaving the familiar confines of her segregated black community in order to cross town to visit her grandparents. And en route, Hooks traverses across neighborhoods and through a, quote, terrifying whiteness, with white faces staring down from porches with hate until finally approaching her sanctuary, the edges of her grandparents' yard and the welcoming faces of people who recognize her humanity. And so in her very, very brief sharing, Hooks also notes the power, right, of maybe what George Lipsitz would call a white spatial logic, okay, that can sometimes animate space even in the absence of any particular hostile face or disapproving gaze, remarking that even empty and vacant porches still communicated danger, othering, and the sense that she was not yet home. And so as scholars of color within the university, we commonly experience the challenges, perhaps even the affective geographies, of navigating a white spatiality. And so the work of Crafting Homeplace then is both an artifact and a process, is to create, as Hooks says, places where people can return to themselves more easily. And even so, while operating as a historical map for our School of Education, it's no blueprint for creating a BIPOC utopia within the university. And so our work is ongoing, and we claim no easy victories, or perhaps any victories at all. And like Hooks, we have strived to create a place to transcend our tiredness in order to rehearse and strategize even more appropriate freedom dreams. So as I close my comments, I want to leave you just with a couple questions, right? And I think these are pertinent across the book and pertinent across the folks we're going to hear today, right? What does it mean to quote, codify humanization as a harm place, right? Rather than relying on institutions to grant us a space of belonging. And how do we move beyond mere survival within the academy to create a radical home place that can perhaps nourish our collective freedom dreams? Right? What does it mean to dream beyond survival? And how do we hold space for generative contradictions? We talk about these a lot in the book, recognizing the limits of the university while refusing to be contained by them. And so we're clear that home place is not a utopia or a static retreat, but a site of work, even contradiction, even as it offers respite. Right? But it can be where we gather strength, not to just endure, but to build and to push beyond what exists towards what must be. Okay, so this is both the challenge and the possibility or promise of home place. Okay, so as we sit with some of these questions, not just as intellectual exercises, but as perhaps guides for how we shape our understanding and embodiment, right, of a political project of education. Okay, I want to return back to the parable of the three stonecutters, remembering, right, that we don't want to reduce our work to merely stone cutting. Okay, if we work towards a clarity, if we collectively name what we're building, then perhaps we can be the architects for the future and present that we need. This is the vision of education, of a scholarship that we must craft relationally. Okay? So, with this in mind, I want to introduce some of the authors from the book as they discuss their chapters and embody different dimensions of the project, how they make sense of this work conceptually, methodologically, interpersonally, and in practice. First, we'll hear from co-authors of our chapter on epistemic collaging and homemade methodologies, who show us how knowledge is not just something we cite, but something we can create, remix, and reclaim. Professor Dave Donahue will provide some brief institutional context to the homemade methodologies course, okay? And then we'll get into some weeds from former students, now professors. That's right. And we didn't check in beforehand, so Professor Igosa, you can check me afterwards. Okay. Obaiza Momoan. Solid. I'm going to work on that. Okay. Hamilton, who's now at Stanford University. Right? That's right. And Patricia Rojas Zambrano, who is at the University of San Francisco. So we'll get into a little bit of weeds there, and they have some beautiful, beautiful offerings for us. And then we'll hear from Assistant Professor Sine Chong of Leadership Studies. Okay. And also co-author of Challenging Academic Feudalism, which calls out the exploitive hierarchies of academia and is asking us to think about how we build new, maybe more just models of knowledge production and mentorship and femtorship. And so finally, we'll spotlight our dean, Professor Shabnam Karal-Azad, who across our section, not necessarily a chapter, but this section is Fighting for Intending Home Place. reminding us that Homeplace is not static, but a process of care, of struggle, and cultivation. And so following these discussions, we'll transition to a brief panel discussion where we're going to invite all of the co-authors of the piece to reflect upon some of the key themes of the book and meaning for them and for us. Okay, so thank you all.
David, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
We have a number of students here, so
Yeah.
I think if those who are presenting could actually
That's
come
great.
up and we can have a few seats, and then if there's space near
Along the-
you.
Cool, we can do that. So maybe
Any
authors.
faculty who are willing to give.
Okay. Faculty, you got to go outside. And then.
Hey, how are you doing? Good, good to see you.
Next slide. Hey. I think we have a couple seats in the third row. Folks want to maybe grab those. Folks,
There's two
Got you.
seats right up here.
okay. So can presenters use the mic just so the folks outside can also hear?
Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
All right. Hello. My name is David Donahue, and I had the real pleasure, and I mean pleasure, and honor of writing this chapter with USF then students and recent alums, and now people making a difference in the field, shaping the field, which I think gets at why we do this work. The chapter that you're about to hear from is called Epistemic Collaging, Creating Homemade Methodologies for Educational Research. Most of you are probably familiar with collage. You made collages when you were in elementary school. It's one of the most accessible art forms, right? If you've got scissors and glue sticks, you can make a collage. But it's also a really powerful and serious art form, more than we might associate with one that we also do in kindergarten. Collage helps us reconfigure, reposition, rejuxtapose, remix ideas and ways of seeing the world. And the result, the recontextualized, repositioned piece of art, helps us look at the world with new eyes. And that's one of the goals in the advanced methodology class here at USF, Gen Ed 712. I've been teaching that class with colleagues here for a number of years. And while many people will choose traditional methodologies to do their research, and that's totally fine, there are good reasons to do case study or ethnography or grounded theory, many students also choose to create their own methodologies, which bring together their own ideas, their own perspectives on seeing the world in ways that are humanizing, in ways that prioritize relationships over fetishizing methods, that are healing, that are about mutual aid, that are about these other things that we prioritize in research. Rather than just hoping our research will make a difference in the end because of its implications, we can use our research as part of a process of changing and making the world better. So I'm very excited that these two authors are going to tell you a little bit more, Gosa and Patricia, about their methodologies that they created.
All right, hello everyone. I'm really happy to be back at USF because this is such a pivotal place for me to even have this as a methodology. So I want to talk about 4C methodology, which is something that I was able to kind of think through in a lot of ways. I want to start by highlighting some of the courses that some of y'all might be in, but that were influential in my ability to kind of think about research differently. Creating my homemade method with Dr. Fuentes was critical. Some of the work I read in critical ped around autoethnography, Black imagination with David, like all of these classes were key to my thinking and trying to see where I fit in, if I have to fit in, creating my own world, whatever that looks like. And then these are some of the scholars that I've read in my time at USF that have been impactful in how I think about the work that I'm doing, the work that I want to contribute, the communities that I want to work with. Some of these faces you might know, you have read, some of them maybe not. I gotta shout out Rhapsody because this particular album, Eve by Rhapsody, where she lists a Black woman for the name of each song and talks about it in such a beautiful, community, humanizing way, was really inspirational in general with my focus on Black women and in the research that I've done. So kind of shouting out all those things to kind of introduce us to the work. First, I got to talk about my theoretical framing with this work. I have to highlight some of the Black feminist theorists that I read during my time at USF. And the reason I highlight this is it allowed me to understand that the lived experiences of Black women can be central to the work that I'm doing. No ifs, ands, buts about it. Two, Black Crit, which of course is rooted in critical race theory, but Black Crit is really thinking about the specificity of the Black experience, right? So yes, we can talk about race in its general form, but speaking about the Black experience was key to my work. And also understanding that it's critical for us to understand the Black experience to then understand the other stratified experiences that are happening in the world. And then intersectionality, I think for me, this was a really key turning point in the focus of my research. Because intersectionality, we talk a lot about race and gender, especially for Black women, but for me, I also wanted to think about how does hair play a role in my intersectional identity? What role is that in my navigation of the world, how I'm perceived, all of those things. And then finally, Black methodologies. Some of the ones that I was introduced to really talked about how to do research in a humanizing way, specifically for and by Black community members. So these are my framings for it, which is really important. And I want to talk about the groundwork of Black women specifically, and scholars that are Black women that helped carve out this lane that I'm kind of in. So one, in Darkened Feminist Epistemology, this is Cynthia Dillard, and what this work taught me is there's a very important role in Black knowings that we have to understand as we're doing research, and that's a role that isn't valued in the academic space as much. What does it mean to just know as a Black person? And so this was kind of critical to thinking about how do we kind of unmask the oppressive constrictions of research and how it's targeted, how it's done. This led to me thinking about In Darkened Story Work by Stephanie Tolliver, where she talks about just storytelling, like passing down information generation after generation, and how we can think about that as a tool to remove the extractive work of research, where you go into a community, you take the research, you do your thing, and then you bounce. You never really are concerned about the community afterwards. And so this was key in my understanding about the role of our stories. And then finally, Daughtering, which is Venus Evans Winters, and she is talking about like women, like mother to daughter, historically, what all that means. What is it about our embodied knowledge that we have in us that is passed down through generations, and that is specifically about the lived experiences of Black women. So this was kind of all the groundwork that I'm laying out to understand why I thought about centering coarse hair. Centering coarse hair because when we look at the hair scale, we have 1A, which is the straightest hair type. We got 4C at the very bottom, which is the most coarse hair type, the coiliest, most often associated with Black women for sure. What I wanted to do, inspired by all of that groundwork, was think about where does Black hair fit into all of that? What do I know as a result of my embodied knowledge through my hair? Through sitting between my mother's legs and getting my hair done, through moving in the world where not only was my skin an identifier for me, but also my hair was an identifier for me. So what does that mean? What does that look like? How can I center that? And that's kind of where the 4C methodology was from. And I want to highlight that when talking about coarse hair, I'm specifically talking about 4C And it's not to not acknowledge that there are many hair types in the Black community, but it's to center the hair type that is most discriminated against. It's to center the hair type that is always often categorically negatively associated. And so by centering 4C, I'm not leaving out any of the other girlies. I'm bringing everybody with me, but I want to center this particular type for that reason. I want to talk a little bit about Black embodied intuition as well, which is thinking about what I know through my body, through my hair, through my tresses. How many of you have heard of the big chop? Okay, the big chop. You have somebody who has done the big chop a lot of times, and with the women that I talk to, doing the big chop is like, I'm not just cutting my hair, but I'm letting go of that bad relationship. I'm letting go of all the stress that I've experienced over the years. I am starting anew for myself. This is an embodied thing. I feel like there are things being carried in my hair that I have to let go of. So valuing the knowledge that we carry in our hair, the experiences that we carry is really important. And Black embodied intuition, I read Cultural Intuition by Bernal and was inspired by that, and thinking about what is it about our knowing as Black women through our hair, when we're getting our hair done, the wisdom passed down as we're in those salons and doing all of that work, what does that look like? So all of this is the groundwork for the 4C methodology, which is rooted in 4 elements. When we think about research, I'm talking about value for the 4C methodology of research done by Black women and the embodied intuition that comes from that. 2, I'm talking about research that should be done in community, not I'm doing research on this community, but I'm doing research with this community. And my goal here is to make sure that I am doing something restorative. I also have restorative elements as 4C methodology, which is what does it mean to honor the restorative nature of our memories, of our experiences. And the goal is often rooted in disrupting the hegemonic systems that dominate research in general. A lot of traditional research, especially when we're talking about the Black community, we're talking about Black women, Black girls, is really not rooted in our care, our humanity, and those are things that I wanted to disrupt with the 4C methodology. In doing the 4C methodology, I was able to create a method that I thought was also of service to the women that I was working with. I interviewed 7 women over 4 months through the Moisturize and Wrapped Healing Circles, which is going back to giving back to the community, not just being extractive, but creating a space for us where we spent 2.5 hours doing our thing, being in community, listening to music, creating playlists, doing art, writing poetry, co-constructing, just being together as Black women educators. And all of this stuff that we did together, I was able to use the 4C methodology in my analyzation of those things, right? So what is it that I knew that I could be guided by from my own experience, from my own embodied knowledge, using the 4C methodology to understand all the information that came from us just spending time together, from us centering healing, from us centering our creativity and our stories as Black women educators. I'm gonna pause there. Yep, that's it.
Dope.
So.
Hello. Give me a second. I have a little bit of a setup. Okay, so to make things a little bit more material, more cozy, more home place. Okay. 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 Let's see. So I'm going to be talking to you about more than my methodology. I think my journey to get to that methodology and my process of crafting my home place in academia. So corazonar, sentir pensar y sentir saber means to heart, sense, feel, think, and sense, feel, know. So together, I hope that through the 5 minutes that I have, we do a little bit of that. So first, I want to invite you to this sinkhole, el cenote. This is from Ansaldoan theory. El cenote is this personal and collective unconscious and reservoir of knowledge. So let's all, for a minute, just breathe in together and imagine that instead of this musty room, we're sitting in this beautiful cenote, like mermaids, living between worlds and exploring the depths of knowledge and wisdom. Okay, so first I want to start with saying that all of this work and the crafting of Homeplace for me as an academic has been through art and through my identity as an artist. As an artist, I make tangible, deeper and profound truths about the universe. So to start my journey, I am an expressive arts therapist and somatic psychotherapist. And I had been practicing for 20 years before coming back to pursue doctoral studies. I worked in community mental health, and I brought kind of all that experience and all the knowledge that I had acquired through practice and through art. And then I entered doctoral studies here at USF, and just seeing some of the, especially public scholarship and social and critical theoretical foundations of education, they just felt like really heavy bricks, and I thought they were going to be the most boring classes that I would ever take just from those names. But I found myself feeling a lot in those classes, and not only thinking, but engaging with my classmates, with my professors, with the readings, with the authors in such an exciting and alive way that things started to take more and more shape for me. So this is my homemade theory that I made in Emma's class. She was my professor in the social and critical theoretical foundations. And I think that that was the first place where I started to peel away all the layers of what it meant to know and where that knowledge came from. And just kind of like that provocation or that invitation to craft my own theory that was not something that I could explain the world theoretically, not from the book or, the book, but from something that came from me and from my experiences was very powerful. And also that I could partially present an assignment through my art started to propel me forward in that commitment to involving more of the arts in the future work that I was going to be doing as a scholar. I already used it as an artist and as a therapist, but then as a scholar. So these are some of the courses that I took that were very instrumental in shaping my thinking, not just my feeling. And lastly, the last course, which is the course that I took with Professor Donahue, where it just kind of became possible. Yeah, you can make up your own methodology. Wait, what? I can do that? So that was really special. So this is my homegrown theory. These are some of the conceptual frameworks that guide my work, and you're probably familiar with all of them. I think that my most important thing is that as I read and I learned and I kind of found myself resonating, I wanted to center critiques to dominant systems of knowledge. I also wanted to embrace liberatory practices, self-reflective knowledge and critical self-reflective practice, right? Liberatory action and embodied knowledge. So all of these kind of theories really spoke to me and accompanied me and continue to accompany me. I engage with them in dialogue, and their words are really empowering for me as I read them. So this is my methodology. Because I had already come in as an artist and wanted to incorporate more of the art into the work, I started to look for arts-based research methodologies that were already in existence. And I came across artography, which is already more process-oriented methodology than actually looking at end products or it's inquiry-based, it's very relational. But in my exploration, I also wanted the work that I was about to do to be healing to me, to heal the splits that I brought of my mind and my body, my soul, my feelings. I wanted it to be a work that kind of brought together mind, body, that broke down dichotomies, so researcher researched, and that would be healing not just for me, but for those that I was engaging with in dialogue. I kind of tapped onto a felt sense of excitement and empowerment when I thought about sitting with other colleagues and kind of talking about what was the kind of work that we wanted to do as therapists. I worked with therapists, and that's what's kind of like where I first started using the work. Then now I'm just going to share a few images of the different art. So the other thing is that as the semesters went on, I engaged in parallel art making constant. And the media would change all the time. Sometimes it would be collage. These are different collages that I made. And sometimes it would be something like this. So this is something I did during my literature review. I had these little small pads of paper and colored pencils. And I think I slowly started to, when you're doing a literature, you're kind of reading and reading and reading and reading and going around the topic in different ways, kind of parceling it out and trying to get at the center of something, right? So a lot of drawings that I made at that time were sort of like this. Now, as I was entering the actual data collection phase of my research, I sort of had to pump myself up quite a bit. There was a lot of doubt, and I was like really a lot in the dark. So I wrote down this manifesto, which was an invitation not to perfection, but to be in relationship with those I was working with, in relationship to myself, and in integrity with the work. And just to kind of jump in and trust the process, which was what was going to be the most meaningful part of the work. And lastly, as I would like us to do here too, is kind of like go pause and go inward, and also attune to what the spirits and the cenote might bring to us. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to have, so people who have taken classes with me know that I'm really bossy when it comes to a timer. So here's the opportunity for like what goes around comes around. I'm going to try to boss myself with this timer. So we'll try that. Okay. So to speak to sort of what Dr. Felicien was talking about, it's really important to name what we're sort of working against, right? To be really clear about what we're working against. And so the chapter that I'm doing, hi everyone, my name's Sinead Chong. For those of you that don't know me, so I'm going to be talking about humanizing graduate research apprenticeships. And so what we were working against in creating these research teams was this thing called academic feudalism, which when Danfeng first said this to me, like my mind was blown, right? But, higher ed really operates under this idea of academic feudalism, right? Which is, for folks, feudalism is a system where you have this lord, faculty member, sort of doles out like privileges, gifts, and protection, right? For all the vassal, the graduate students like work, labor, loyalty. And if you kiss the ring enough, and if you work hard enough, and you give them all your time, right, maybe you'll be lucky enough to get your own little fiefdom, a tenure track position, where you can reproduce these processes, right? And so the research team is a really interesting space because it is sort of like the core, like, social unit, right? It's like it's like a family unit that produces the labor of knowledge production, right? And so it's through these relationships that this feudal logic gets reproduced, right? And so my co-authors, Bianca Haro, Damfang Sotoviho-Kun, and Cece Jordan, were part of a larger multi-institutional research team that experimented with ways that we could refuse these feudal logics, right? And so I'm going to share a few insights from our work together that lasted 5+ years. Our research team together was together for 5+ years. And we produced multiple peer-reviewed papers, reports, practitioner tools, and garnered additional grants and an award from AERA. And so I say all those outcomes because I want to be clear, our outcomes, while we knew we had to produce those things, the purpose of our research team was not for the production of those things solely, right? The greater purpose of our research team was actually towards our own humanization. To really strengthen who we were as people, right? And to give us a space to practice those relations of where we wanted to go, right? And what we wanted to be and the world we wanted to build together, right? And I think this is really exemplified in the principles of collective labor that were proposed by Dr. Kuhn in our first big research team meeting that I'm going to just leave for you to sort of take in behind me as I share a few of the ways we made this concrete in our team. So the first way we did this, I think, was actually through really redefining what skills and expertise meant, right? So that wasn't about actually research skills. We looked for people whose lives were committed to praxis, given their social identities and their life histories, right? So the 4 co-authors are all women of color, children of immigrants, and formerly enslaved people, and that's how we navigate this world, and that's our larger purpose, to think about a world where those folks matter and are centered, right? Our research team members had peoples whose lives were impacted by the criminal justice system, patriarchal violence, economic disinvestment, and to us, that was the expertise we wanted informing our research project, right? So we really looked at those expertise and the skills that come with being those people, right? The second thing we did was center sort of the educative function of research rather than the labor of research, right? So that means we spent a lot of time training our students, right? So yeah, we spent a lot of time training our students. Also, it means all the research tasks were shared amongst everybody from PI, Dr. Kuhn was PI, I was the postdoctoral scholar on this project, right? We did all those research tasks alongside our students, right, our graduate students. And there were opportunities for students to try out new skills, right? So if students wanted to lead a training, right? If students wanted to write a paper, those opportunities were for everybody, right? Typically, the writing the paper is reserved for sort of the most elite graduate students, right? They do all the work, and then the PI comes in and makes edits and then puts their name on it, right? So that wasn't the way we did it. We had we really emphasized the educative function of research and what it means to sort of do inquiry in that way. I think most importantly is that we did the labor of research within the context of critical consciousness raising. Okay? So we actually read a lot of critical theory together, okay? And we engaged, so this allowed us to engage in a collective process of data analysis that was really rigorous because it was informed by all these vantage points that I mentioned earlier, right? And a shared theoretical language, right? And so, I read somewhere, recently, someone was like, you kind of need theory to have your experience on the margins become the cutting edge. And I was like, oh, that's kind of what we did. We sharpened our sort of experience on the margins with theory, right? And it really pushed our analyses and I think developed some really critically rigorous papers, right? there's my time. Okay, so really quickly, so just to say that this process strengthened us as scholars, but it also sort of helped people interrogate other aspects of our lives. So humanization is not just as a scholar, but who we are as a whole person, right? So during this process, we had a team member that called out classist and racist behavior at her workplace and essentially became a whistleblower, right? And it was through the support of our research team that I think some of this was facilitated, right? To note, this is where USF as an institution matters. Not having the demands of publish or perish really freed up faculty, such as Dr. Kuhn and I, to be able to sort of really invest in this educative process, right? I'll run quickly through the other things. The sort of third thing that I wanted to know was the distribution of financial resources. So Dr. Kuhn has some really great principles about engaging with philanthropy in the chapter, but this really allowed her to sort of develop a relationship with our funder to fairly compensate people for their work, which is huge, right? And in addition to that, we actually redistributed financial resources to people who are actually going through a really hard time, right? So that financial resources weren't just for compensation of labor, but it's like to recognize actually our world is pretty tough and sometimes some people need more, right? And so that was a principle we used. And then finally, we did a lot of community building, right? We had a check-in and bi-weekly research meetings, and we had a sort of an open-ended check-in where people really shared what they were going through, right? We broke bread together on data collection trips. We ate really well. I always gained 5 pounds on data collection trips. And we just we built family together, right? And I think it speaks to the durability of our relationships because, as I mentioned, we were together, the core of our research team was together for 5+ years. And I would say maybe 2 years of that, people were actually not getting paid regularly, right? We were finding additional grants to pay people when we could, but people were just showing up because this relationship meant something to them, right? And many of these practices live on sort of through the See Her Freedom Dreaming mini grants, right? Where we recognize USF students as the people who are committed to praxis, right? And that grants are redistributed from the university to support projects and research that make a difference, right? And that, USF students are at the cutting edge of that. So shout out the See Her Freedom Dreaming mini grants, and then those are going to come out in a little bit. So the RFP is going to come out in a little bit, so keep your eyes out for that. So just want to close with the idea that community building is really important, right? But the emotions and the work of trust and care and mutual responsibility and mutuality actually I don't think is enough to resist the feudal logics that have been built up over centuries and centuries in the university, right? These trust, care, mutuality need infrastructure, right? The co-editors in the introduction cite Dr. Ruthie Gilmore, who talks about freedom needing infrastructure, right? Freedom needs to be concrete, it needs to be material. And I think some of these principles are the ways we made care and trust material, concrete. We made it robust enough to withstand sort of the demands and pushes from feudalism, from capitalism, and all those isms, right? So that's it. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to adjust our program a little bit. We were going to hear from Dean Shabnam, who is practicing the fundamental principle of conscious critical refusal. Okay, but we're gonna bypass her piece. Please speak to our Dean Shabnam over food and whatnot when we break. But I want to invite all of the co-authors just to kind of come up real quick. And what we had intended, if we had a little more time, this really should have been 90 minutes. If you all could just kind of come up to the front, we were going to have just some Q&A. So I actually want to just, are you all going to come up? Or yeah, that's your cue. And again, I want to thank everyone for their contributions in this project. I want to thank everyone for kind of speaking to some of their chapters today. And maybe we're almost at time, but maybe we can take about 5 minutes for some audience Q&A. Particularly, I think we have a lot of graduate students that are in the building. And so I think for our co-authors, we want to just kind of hold their realities close, right, as we think about the implications of Crafting Homeplace in the academic borderlands for their work and for our work beyond the university.
There you go.
Right? So let's maybe take about 5 minutes for audience questions and Q&A, and then we can adjourn to our patio outside where I think we have some music and some food. Maybe let's take a couple questions from folks.
Dr. Agosta? Yes. You created the 4C methodology, but then what did you apply it to? My dissertation research. So everything I did with my dissertation for the year that I was working with those women was using the 4C methodology as the framing for how I'm going to work with this community. And that's where the method, the moisturize and wrap healing circles came in. And then when I'm analyzing the data, still using that same, like my own knowings as a Black woman with 4C hair to interpret what I'm getting out of this. So those were kind of the ways in which I used the methodology to do the work. How do I work with this community as a Black woman researcher? And then how do I analyze the data, knowings that are rooted in me and my hair? Does that make sense? Not really. Okay. Now, we can do it at the reception.
And it's worth reading Agosta's dissertation and the amazing journals articles that she's published since in top leading journals.
Top leading, top, yeah.
Maybe a couple more.
I was wondering, what are some barriers that prevented the creation of inclusive and affirming spaces in academia, and how might you create barriers to overcome that? Like, what are the creation of different barriers to overcome those?
Did you read my notes? Because that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask if we had more time. So I appreciate you with that talk. Okay, so really, I think important question, right? How are we thinking about that as faculty, as members of the university, for ourselves, for kind of the collaborative work, and for graduate students and other folks that are coming alongside and sometimes behind us? I think really important question. So thank you for that.
I think Shabnam has something to say.
Yes. I was volunteering Dr. Katz.
No, you.
Who was here.
Go ahead, you.
So the question was, how do we create, right, humanizing spaces? So, for those of you who were able to attend the talk with Ruha Benjamin, one of the really amazing things that stuck with me from that conversation was, this notion of, as we sort of think about institutions and society at large right now and, all the issues, it's so easy to get stuck in the flaws and what's not working and so on and so forth. And alongside that, there's this notion of if we're not building and creating, then what do we have to replace when all of this crumbles? That notion. So that is sort of what has driven my work, and also in thinking about, so I think one theme in terms of, how do you build these, whether we call it subcultures or cultures within larger institutions or spaces that don't necessarily reflect those values and attributes, is relationships, right? Like that's been like the through line, I feel like this relational part that requires some work. It requires us to examine ourselves, what are ways in which we show up, what are ways in which we can work with, what do we believe in, and do we actually reflect those values in the work that we do, right? Because I also often say that we're at a time when everyone says all the right things, and so unless it's felt, right, unless you actually feel it, it's hard to actually find it compelling that this is actually possible. So there's that part of it, but there's also this, there's collective work,
right? So part of what I was going to talk about earlier is the way we see institutions shift, and some of the chapters by others talk about this too, is it actually does require us to, like Sine was thinking, think about what it is we're working towards, what we're up against, to really identify that. But then really the best work that happens is often a reflection of collective wisdom, right? It's never one person.
Right.
And so that kind of relational work, committing to that, is important. Now, what is even more essential in that is a posture of learning. It's a posture, I often say it's a humble posture of learning that's required, regardless of who we are or what we feel like we know or so on. Creating cultures within institutions or changing institutions is not something that many of us have actually experienced. Right. So to enter into it with this, like, what are we trying to learn from this process? And then how do we iterate, and how do we learn, and how do we sort of make this happen over a period of time, which I think is documented so well in a chapter by Dr. Katz and Dr. Kamangyan over the history, right? Like, call it the genealogy of place. Like, how does this happen over time, and how do we commit to that now and, into the future? I don't know if that really addressed the question, but all these sort of different points.
And is there an inclusivity in those collapses?
Yes.
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 Yes, and that's not to say that anything is perfect or that we figured it out, right? That this is a process and a reflection of a process that we are committed to. I think that's the important part, yeah.
What recommendations could you give to make research more humanizing for us grad students? How to approach communities and do research within community?
I have the bad fortune of being at the end of the line. Hi everyone, I'm Genevieve Negro Gonzalez. I think asking the question is fundamentally is also the answer, right? Is like, and not asking that question with an assumption that it gets resolved at any point along the way, right? But thinking at every step, and I know that as a grad student in particular, it's difficult because you're like, I'm on a timeline. I got like, right? It's like this thing feels very concrete, like that it's moving forward. It's not. You're not in a situation where you're like, let me like build relationships for 3 years and then I can, right? So I think what it comes down to, for me at least, is thinking about how do we find the places where we are already in community? How do we not take for granted the fact that we are already sort of embedded in the work, and think about the work in a different way, so that the work that we have to do as a part of our research, as a part of our dissertation, as a part of our scholarly contribution is embedded in who we are, the communities we're already moving in, the places where we are connected. If you're early on in your research journey and you think, I don't know that I'm connected, you should probably be connected for reasons way beyond your dissertation work, right? This is a moment, I think, politically in this country where like the disconnection and the overwhelm is tremendous. And I think we have a responsibility to ourselves and a responsibility. You guys see what happens when you do that? We have a responsibility to ourselves. We have a responsibility to each other to like be connected and to forge those connections and to force those connections. Yes. Because even in that, it's like the resistance that we need to hold on to, and that is what good research is, right? Is like hunkering down in those places, insisting that we build those connections and those communities. Redefining research in that process and then building from there.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the responses. I think that's a great segue. Bell Hooks also talks about this idea of kind of the metaphor of the porch, right? And as an extension of this home place, right? The necessity for us to have that porch. as a third space, right, to restore ourselves, right, to look out and see who's passing by, right, to make connections. So as we hope, of course, that our launch day of the book and the book itself has been an invitation to think about some of these questions in terms of how we think about home place and how can we be more intentional in defining our home place and how we need to do that collectively. So I want to thank everyone for being here. We got some food outside. We got some music. Check out the porch. Meet some new people.
Right.
And let's continue to build this home place.